Well, today I want to record a video responding to a supporter's message regarding a previous video. And the question that was asked was a really good one. So in a previous video, I was talking about the French defense a little bit. And there's a line in the French where after knight c6, sometimes rather than playing the main line, knight f3, less experienced players sort of have that itch to deliver a pin, and they play bishop b5. And although the move is, certainly playable, maybe not the best move in the world. And we were talking about the point that as black, I can play the move bishop d7, which is a normal move in the French for this bishop. I mean, okay, it doesn't have too many choices after e6, but this is a perfect square for the bishop. And I've mentioned that a number of my students, and as well as myself in a number of online games, I've encountered the opportunity to win a pawn in a really cool way. And for those of you that haven't seen the previous video, after knight f3 or any sort of standard developing move, black has this really cool idea, knight takes e5. And we're discovering the bishop's attack there against its rival. So if the knight or pawn captures our knight, then we recapture the bishop. So remember, we captured a pawn, then we lost a knight, and now we captured a bishop. And the cool thing about capturing the bishop is now our light squared bishop doesn't have a rival on the light squares, and it's preventing the king from getting out of dodge. Slicing through the light squares there, the king is unable to castle through a check. So therefore, the king is feeling a little bit restrained, a little bit stuck in a seatbelt there with the bishop. So going back, this was the concept that I discussed in the previous video. It's a cool trap, and if the bishop captures its rival in kind, then rather than capturing the bishop and losing our knight, since the knight is endangered, we combine defense with capturing the bishop. And so when the smoke clears, we want a pawn. So just to see that one more time, you play bishop d7, aligning with the loose or unprotected bishop, X-ray alignment. And if white isn't careful, on the very next move, you can play the impossible looking knight takes e5, right? And this way, we're winning a pawn at the end of this combination. So one of the viewers asked, hey, this idea is pretty cool. And I play a line in the Caro-Kann where I get a similar sort of situation. And is this a good idea? And the viewer mentioned, would you recommend the move bishop d7 in a similar sort of situation in the trappy nature of the line? And if so, how do I generally make a choice between two moves in my repertoire when they both seem playable? So really, really good question. So what the viewer was mentioning is instead of playing e6, the cousin to the French, meaning the French prepares d5 with a pawn. A pawn's best friend is another pawn, so you play e6 to then prepare d5 on the next move. Well, the cousin of the French defense is the Caro-Kann, pushing the c-pawn one square, and after white claims space in the center, puts two pawns there, now black is ready to play d5. And so just like in the French, the pawn that we threaten can advance. And so the big difference here between the Caro and the French, if I go over here, this is the French, notice there's a pawn on e6 and not on c6. And so that means that our light squared bishop is blocked, a little bit restricted. But on the other hand, the dark squares are open for business, and the bishop is ready to support a central pawn break with c5. So flipping back over to Caro-Kann territory, the benefit of the Caro-Kann is that the light squared bishop has more flexibility, has more room to grow, so to speak. On the other hand, the c6 pawn does block the knight. It doesn't help develop the king side yet. And if you want to play for that c5 pawn break, you have to spend another tempo, right? Because in the French, you play c5 in one move. So a lot of pros and cons here. It's a matter of taste. Both openings are excellent. Now, what the viewer was asking is he has a repertoire where you play c5. Immediately when the pawn moves to e5, it's claiming space. It's restricting our knight. It's restricting our bishop. Really annoying pawn. So you want to fight against the pawn chain here, the base of the pawn chain, trying to remove it. So if white plays a random move, then I would take. And this way I'm removing a key guard of this pawn. And then I can kind of just swarm my pieces around e5 and attack it. And so that's why, when you're playing as white and you're just kind of starting out, figuring out your openings, you might see the move c3 with the idea, if you take me on d4, isolating my bold advanced pawn, you can maintain your burden of space there, shall we say, by taking with this pawn. And that way you have a good pawn chain supporting one another. So long story long, what the viewer brought up in a very clever manner is, hey, after this, in bishop b5, isn't it the case that I could play the same idea? Bishop to d7. Very clever connection, so nice job bringing that point to our attention. And I think the short answer is yes, you definitely can do that, with the point that, if the knight moves to f3, we still have that same idea. Knight takes e5. And it's really useful to think about the differences, right? So when we were here in the French, hopefully nobody's getting too much motion sickness switching back between the French and the Caro. Here I had knight takes e5. And one thing I'd like to point out is here, if I ever try to take this pawn, notice the bishop is able to recapture. If we go back to Caro-Kann territory, there's a little bit of a twist here, that if I take and take back, you have to think about whether or not it's okay for white to take the pawn here. And notice the difference is there's no way for the bishop to recapture. So it just becomes a little bit of a push and pull game. Now, another thing I do want to think about is that I don't have a pawn on e6 like the French guarding the d5 pawn. So if I play bishop d7 right away, it also blocks my queen's defense of d5. So we need to think about what could happen if white captured on c5 right here, right now, revealing the queen's attack against the currently undefended d5 pawn. And the interested viewer can definitely deep dive. E6 is one direction to look at, and you can embrace some chaos by immediately capturing the pawn, discovering the bishop's attack there against its rival. And again, a lot of complications here. So definitely, nothing like terribly wrong with bishop d7 at all. Certainly playable, and an interesting idea. Now, to answer your question, like, how do I decide? Should I play this trappy move? I'm not 100% sure, because after knight f3, when I was preparing this video, one thing I learned that really surprised me is if black plays knight e5, this line is actually not even bad for white. It might even be slightly favorable, which seems hard to believe, but I learned something just thanks to that question, is that after knight e5 and bishop takes, now there's a little bit of a difference here, is notice the c5 pawn is not protected by the bishop, right, as it would be with e6. So the engine actually points out that you can take the pawn. And the big point here is when you play e6, saying, okay, I'm ready to take, now we see a pawn avalanche. You could play b4 immediately, or you could gain a tempo with a4. And, maybe the bishop would like to move back. But as I mentioned in the other example, hey, that's the uncontested ruler of the light squares. We can prevent white from castling. You might try to step back, but here comes that pawn avalanche, b4. And all of a sudden, we have to be really careful that we don't just lose our bishop to the pawn, and then it's just completely trapped. So the more I kind of looked at the line, the more I realized, okay, maybe this trap isn't so good in the Caro-Kann. Just to review, here I can play knight e5, white can recapture, and after bishop takes, we have to reckon with d takes c5. And so whether you're studying an opening, whether you're analyzing a game, the computer recommends a resource, it's always a really healthy exercise to ask, what are the differences here? And so if we go back, to our French example last time, I promise, after knight f3, knight takes, I had mentioned that after knight takes e5, we can capture the bishop here. And the big difference is, if white takes the pawn in the Caro, that bishop's blocked. But in the French, we can just take the pawn, and now the B's are buzzing down the diagonals, the two bishops, and pointing toward the king side. So really good question about the French versus the Caro. Okay, so returning to that Caro-Kann example, bishop d7 is probably not ideal. Okay, I did say we wouldn't look at the French variation one more time, but I do want you to imagine the pawn on e6 in the French. One of the reasons we play bishop d7 is this is a move we're going to play anyway. Meaning, okay, we'll go back to the French one last time. I know a lot of you don't like the French, some of you love it, so bear with me one last time. Instead of bishop to b5, the main move is knight f3, and often the bishop will move to e2, or maybe aggressive gambiteers might try out bishop d3. But the reason I'm showing this is that when we talk about move orders and we talk about what to play, here, this bishop, generally speaking, belongs on d7. And it connects the back rank. Rook c8 is possible at some moment, taking advantage of the space the bishop left behind. And the bishop is guarding kind of this important pawn and defending its knight. So just to be clear, in the French, the bishop kind of knows its purpose and is more than happy to kind of meditate on its original square or simply move one square diagonally forward. And that's really typical. By the way, I've played this line, and you guessed it, bishop b5 shows up here too. And you still have knight e5. But the main point to take is that even if my opponent doesn't blunder with bishop b5, this is where my bishop is typically developed in the French if I'm not trying to like trade it off or something. So going back to the Caro, you don't have that burden, right? Your bishop could move here, but in the future, you know, it could move to f5. Maybe there's a knight f3 in the air and you pin down the knight to its queen. You have a lot of flexibility. And so here, I believe the viewer mentioned that the course quoted recommends queen a5. Really funky, aggressive move, basically putting the question to the bishop and also pinning the pawn to the king. Remember how I talked about c takes d4 earlier, trying to remove the guard of e5. Well, this actually helps in that cause because we're pinning the pawn to the king. So after like takes and takes, if you know, white plays a random move, here's an example of c takes d4 shining, right? There's no c takes d4 in response because of the pin there. So anyway, I like this queen a5. I haven't played the Caro too much, but this is a good video to remind me. It's well worth considering. And I like this queen a5 move quite a bit. That was recommended. So if you're to kind of anticipate your question of like, do I choose the trappy bishop d7 hoping for knight e5, or should I follow the main line recommended in this course? I would say, well, what's the alternative? How does the bishop feel? Does the bishop only want to set up a trap there, or does it want to stay flexible so that I'll make a random move for both sides? Now maybe the bishop has more information and says, yeah, you know, maybe I'll pin that knight at some point, right? So I would say in the Caro, your bishop doesn't need to rush to move to d7, whereas in the French, it's just a normal square. The Caro, it feels a little bit weird, like why would I put it there? So let's look at another example to answer the question, should I set up a trap? And how do I decide like what's a good move order? I'm going to show kind of two examples. So if you're playing with the black pieces, the queen's gambit declined, rock solid, same sort of pawn formation as the French, e6, d5, rock solid. And after bishop g5, pinning the knight, you can play bishop e7, unpinning the knight and preparing to castle. So after like e3 and castles and knight f3, there's tons of moves here. And one move that's quite reasonable is knight bd7. We have kind of this infinity knight circle supporting one another. So if the bishop ever captures the knight, the other knight's ready to jump in. And notice I didn't place my knight on c6. And the reason I didn't do that is the pawn break c5. I want to place some pressure on white's center. So if you're someone who plays the Queen's Gambit declined and you like placing your knight here, there's a cool little trap to know. Going back, in this position, you can play the move knight b to d7. And if white plays e3 or whatever, we just kind of enter the same line we just talked about, right? The cool thing about knight b d7 is there's a really nice trap. Although the knight is defending the other knight, it's in the way of the queen. It's blocking the queen's defense of this pawn. So you've removed, so it appears, one of the defenders, and another potential defender of that pawn is pinned to the queen. So it turns out white may be very tempted to say, okay, I'll take you. If you take back with the knight, that exposes your queen. And when you take back, hooray, I've won a pawn. Because if you take my knight like that, well, then you lose your queen, right? So then why would black do that? And so you might say, oh, shoot, I lost a piece or I lost a pawn, and you move on with your life, but there's more to the story. Look out for moments where you say, I can't do something, right? Or I must do something. Absolute language can often limit our possibilities. And in this case, why can't I take that knight? There's a big theme here. The king only has one legal square, d2. So incredibly, bishop b4 looks really scary, attacking the king. But look out, the knight could capture our bishop. Okay, but we have the right idea. How can I play bishop b4 without allowing knight takes bishop? Well, we can play the move that felt impossible. The I can't, turning it into I certainly can move, knight takes knight. And so now we're attacking the bishop, and we're up a piece, right? Because white captured a pawn and we captured a knight. And so when the bishop captures our queen, now we throw in bishop b4. And the king is unable to move, so the queen is forced to block, and we happily capture the queen. King takes, and then our king takes the bishop in kind. And hey, when the smoke clears, I see 2 minor pieces versus 3. We're up a piece. So this is called, I believe, the Cambridge Springs trap. And so therefore, this is an example where if this is in your repertoire, meaning you place your knight here anyway, and you like the opening, you can perfectly play this move with no reservations at all. It has the upside of there being a cool little trap like that with bishop b4 to follow. And if your opponent doesn't fall for the trap, then business as usual. Develop your bishop, castle, play chess. So to summarize, play when you're deciding between like a trappy variation or a opening that has the potential for a trap, feel free to play that move if that's not your most compelling reason to do so. In other words, the knight generally is placed here in some Queen's Gambit decline lines, so this is perfectly playable to play the knight here. It's the main purpose is it supports the other knight. This is where the knight usually belongs. It prepares c5, and it has a bonus. Your opponent might, instead of e3, your opponent might blunder, right? Here they don't have to take, and then, you're just in a normal opening again. But if they do take, there's your trap. And so that's one example. Now, if we go back, some of you have probably seen this before, and for those of you that haven't, you'll have a fun little trap to be aware of. Let's compare that to the Caro-Kann. Knight d7. Okay, so white has, tons of moves. Bishop d3, knight f3, whatever, right? Sometimes when you learn this trap, you might get really excited and play queen to e2, which is not the most attractive move to play. If we ask the light squared bishop how it feels, I think it's going to give the queen the stink eye here. But the idea is, if knight gf6, there's a beautiful mate in one. So if you haven't seen this before, feel free to pause the video. And for those of you that have seen it, or those of you who have worked it out, nice work, knight d6, smothered mate. The pawn is unable to capture our knight because it's pinned by the queen to the king. And so this is a cool little trap to know, but my sort of objection to playing this way is even if you ask the engine says, yeah, this line's fine. White is plus, 0.2 or whatever. It's playable, but most of us are not playing at the level of stockfish, right? And so therefore, I don't think it's easy to play this line when you're blocking your own sort of natural bishop development. It just feels rather artificial. So in this line, Queen e2 is a move you would generally not play. In other words, if I play another move in the Caro, let's say Bishop f5, or one of the streamer choices, Knight f6, a lot of people like that line too, no one is going to say, it's a good move here, Queen e2, right? Here we even lose a pawn. And notice Knight d6 doesn't work. Not only can the king move away, although that's not a great move, it's not mate, much stronger is just moving the queen back and we lose our knight. So this is an example where I would recommend not playing a trappy line if the most compelling reason, as would be the case here, is they might fall for it. But the problem is, what if black plays a normal move, there's no trap anymore, how comfortable are you with your queen on e2? And maybe the answer is you are comfortable and you find a way to play it, and that's great. But the main point is, don't play a trappy line if the most compelling reason is they might fall for it. It can be the second most compelling reason. I like this move, it does X, Y, and Z, helps my position, and they might fall for it. Totally cool. But just don't allow that to be the main reason that you choose a certain line or opening. Okay, well, thanks everybody for hanging out with me. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out in the comments. And also, please check out our chess.com Improvers Club. I'm active there, especially in the Ask a Coach, Ask Community Forum. So if you have questions or you want to reach out there, highly encourage you to do so. All right, well, hope everyone has a great day, and I'll see you next time.